Welcome back everyone, thank you so much for clicking on the video. The Demon Slayer Sorcerer build is aimed at World Tiers 1 and 2. This is the perfect build to help you finish the main story and reach World Tier 3. Now if you're interested in a high damage rogue build for World Tiers 1 and 2, I highly recommend checking out my Demon Slayer rogue build. I'll put a link at the top of the screen right now in case you are interested. Also, thanks to everyone that subscribed to the channel this week and watched my previous videos. The support means everything to me. One of the best things about this Sorcerer build and the Sorcerer class in general is the survivability. You'll notice in the gameplay this class has the capabilities to withstand tons of damage and also deal a significant amount of damage at the same time. The strategy behind this build focuses on freezing enemies, putting them into a vulnerable state, and killing them very quickly. Chilling enemies and freezing them is the main priority for this setup, which is why a majority of our skill point allocation revolves around dealing damage to chilled and frozen enemies. For the basic skill on this build, I'm using Frostbolt. As you may know, basic skills don't consume any mana, which is why they're mainly used for utility to either buff yourself or even nerf enemies. The Frostbolt deals damage and chills enemies for 15%. Stacking enough chill on an enemy will eventually freeze them, which is good since the damage on this build is amplified against frozen enemies. I unlocked 2 modifiers for this build. The enhanced Frostbolt has a 15% chance to explode on chilled enemies. The chances increase to 100% against frozen enemies. This means frozen enemies are guaranteed to explode every time, which is good for AoE against mobs. The second modifier, Glinting Frostbolt, generates 4 mana when hitting chilled or frozen enemies. The main core skill on this build, and also the skill that you will be using the most, is the Ice Shards. This skill launches 5 shards that deal 222 damage each. The damage is increased to 25% against frozen enemies. This skill uses a decent amount of mana to cast, but with the right timing and patience, you'll be able to consistently deal DPS with this skill. The enhanced Ice Shards modifier unlocks a 40% chance for your Ice Shard skill to ricochet to another enemy. Ice Shards will always ricochet off of frozen enemies, so not only do we do extra damage to frozen enemies, our attacks will always ricochet off of them, which is going to help you attack other enemies surrounding them. The Greater Ice Shard is a modifier that works amazing on this build because we are using a defensive skill called Ice Armor that applies a barrier to our character. With this modifier, as long as you have a barrier active, casts of Ice Shard will treat enemies as if they were frozen. This is great because we deal way more damage to frozen enemies, and we can take advantage of the damage buff without having to manually freeze enemies first. Ice Armor forms a barrier around you for 6 seconds, absorbing 33% of your base life in damage. While Ice Armor is active, 5% of your damage dealt is added to the barrier. The enhanced Ice Armor modifier increases your mana regeneration by 25% when Ice Armor is active, so spells are a little bit easier to spam when you're in this defensive state. The Mystical Ice Armor modifier contributes 50% more to Ice Armor barriers when you deal damage to vulnerable enemies. Since freezing enemies amplifies your damage to them, the Frost Nova skill is essential for this build. Frost Nova unleashes a torrent of frost that freezes all enemies around you for 3 seconds. The enhanced Frost Nova modifier reduces the cooldown of Frost Nova for 1 second up to 4 seconds by killing enemies frozen by this skill. Another easy way to amplify your damage is to put your enemies into a vulnerable state. This is made simple by unlocking the Mystical Frost Nova modifier, which makes all enemies affected by Frost Nova vulnerable. Vulnerable enemies will always take 20% increased damage. The Sorcerer class is the most optimal when you play at range. This class has the ability to play close quarters by freezing enemies with Frost Nova and then unleashing extra damage with the Ice Shards, but sometimes you can get overwhelmed and need to reposition to wait for your skills to cool down or even heal up. This is why the teleport skill is on this build. It's really a great skill for just moving around the map and setting up some big damage by funneling enemies. The teleport skill will let you transform into lightning, becoming unstoppable and surging to a target location, dealing damage around you upon arrival. For the ultimate skill, I'm using Inferno. I really like this skill on the Sorcerer class because it does a good job pulling enemies into one spot. So you can set up DPS using Frost Nova or ice armor. The Inferno skill summons a fiery serpent that continuously constricts the target area, burning enemies for 2079 damage over 8 seconds. To make the most out of this ultimate skill, you need to unlock the Prime Inferno modifier, which repeatedly pulls enemies into its center. This just makes every other skill on the build easier to use since you can immobilize more enemies in one given spot. This will help you freeze all enemies around you and cause explosions to eliminate them quickly. This build is really all about keeping your distance and attacking when the time is right. You can deal a lot of damage after freezing enemies, and you'll have many opportunities to destroy everything on screen. It's all about paying attention to your cooldowns and making the most out of every situation. Now that you know how the build is meant to be played, let's break down the stat allocation in the Sorcerer skill tree. Like I mentioned earlier, this build is aimed at world tiers 1 and 2, so anywhere between levels 1 and 50. You'll want to work your way through the skill tree, unlocking the skills themselves first, and then focusing on modifiers and passives after. My Sorcerer is level 38 at the moment. I've been using this build since level 1. Obviously, the build came together over time, but once you know which path you want to take, it makes your choices a lot easier. The basic skill I'm using on this build is Frostbolt. Throw a bolt of frost at an enemy, dealing 296 damage and chilling them for 15%. The enhanced Frostbolt has a 15% chance to explode on chilled enemies, and the chances increase to 100% against frozen enemies, which means every time we freeze enemies with Frost Nova, they will always explode with this modifier active. The second modifier, Glinting Frostbolt, generates 4 mana when hitting chilled or frozen enemies. The main core skill on this build is Ice Shards. Launch 5 shards that deal 246 damage each, deal 25% increased damage to frozen enemies. The enhanced Ice Shard modifier unlocks a 40% chance for your Ice Shard skill to ricochet to another enemy, and the Ice Shards will always ricochet off of frozen enemies. Greater Ice Shards is one of the best modifiers on this build. While you have a barrier active, casts of Ice Shards treat enemies as if they were frozen. The Ice Shard skill does 25% increased damage to frozen enemies, which means every time the Ice Armor skill is active, our damage will be amplified. Ice Armor forms a barrier around you for 6 seconds, absorbing 33% of your base life in damage. While this skill is active, 5% of your damage dealt is added to the barrier. The enhanced Ice Armor modifier increases your mana regeneration by 25% when Ice Armor is active, and the mystical Ice Armor modifier contributes 50% more to Ice Armor's barrier when you deal damage to vulnerable enemies. There's also a passive skill in the defensive skill tree that I highly recommend unlocking as soon as possible. This skill here, Glass Cannon, is a passive skill that lets you deal 18% increased damage at the cost of 9% extra damage in return. High risk, high reward with this one. If you want your attacks to hit harder, unlock this passive skill as soon as you can. I also have Teleport unlocked just so I can increase my mobility and get out of overwhelming situations. It's also great for creating distance and getting behind bosses. Teleport will allow you to transform into lightning, becoming unstoppable and surging to a target's location, dealing damage upon arrival. Frost Nova is our primary source of freezing enemies on this build. The more you upgrade it, the shorter the cooldown will be. Frost Nova unleashes a torrent of frost that freezes all enemies around you for 3 seconds. The enhanced Frost Nova modifier reduces the cooldown of Frost Nova for 1 second up to 4 seconds by killing enemies frozen by this skill. The mystical Frost Nova modifier will make all enemies vulnerable for 4 seconds, increased to 6 seconds against bosses. I'm actually not using any conjuration or mastery skills on this build. After allocating your skill points in the skills that we just went over, you'll eventually have enough points to unlock the ultimate skill for this build, Inferno. This skill summons a fiery serpent that continuously constricts the target area, burning enemies for 2079 damage over 8 seconds. To make the most out of this ultimate skill, you need to unlock the Prime Inferno modifier, which repeatedly pulls enemies into its center. This segment of the skill tree is very important because there's so many ways to increase your damage using these passive skills here. Permafrost increases your frost skill damage by 15% to elites. The Hoarfrost passive increases your damage by 9% to chilled enemies, and 18% to frozen enemies. The next passive here increases your cold damage by 12% to vulnerable enemies. These are some of the strongest passives to unlock, especially if your build focuses on freeze and cold abilities. For the key passive skill at the bottom here, I'm using Shatter, which makes your explosions even more effective after killing frozen enemies. After freeze expires, enemies will explode for 25% of the damage you dealt to them while frozen, which means the more damage you deal to frozen enemies, the more deadly Shatter will be. I really appreciate you guys sticking around till the end of the video. I had a ton of fun creating this video, and hopefully it was easy to follow. Do me a favor, if you enjoyed this video, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow. If you want to see more Diablo 4 builds and guides, consider subscribing to the channel. I have plenty of videos on the way for each class. I'm really excited to explore all of the endgame build possibilities for each class and would love to have you guys here as a part of it. Lastly, don't forget to turn on those bell notifications so you are notified every time I drop a new video. See you guys in the next one.